Imagine being trapped in a wreckage, alone, terrified, and hunted by something that doesn't belong in this world. In this chilling tale, no one escapes, no one survives. But who will be next? Stay with us till the end, because the horror you'll witness isn't just a story. It's a nightmare that might just be watching you. The house was cold. A bitter chill clung to the walls. A single lamp flickered dimly in the corner. The air smelled of dust and neglect. In the distance, a clock ticked loudly. Every second felt like an eternity. The silence was thick. The floorboards creaked under her weight. Her heart pounded with each step. She wasn't alone. A shadow loomed just ahead. She froze. The figure was tall, too tall. Her breath hitched as she realized who it was. A man she thought was long gone. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone. But the device slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor. It shattered. Suddenly, the man was closer. She could smell his cologne. It was sickly sweet. Her legs were paralyzed with fear. Every muscle screamed for her to run. But her body betrayed her. The man's face was pale. His eyes, wide with an unnatural gleam, never left her. A chill ran down her spine. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I told you I'd find you." She opened her mouth to scream. Nothing came out. His hand reached for her throat. She gasped for air. The pressure was suffocating. Her vision blurred. Her limbs felt like stone. The room spun. With a final, desperate effort, she pushed him away. But it was too late. Her world went black. Underscore 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 underscore. In the silence that followed, the house seemed to exhale. The door creaked open, and the man stepped back into the shadows. No one would hear her scream now. The last breath she took was the final sound of her existence. He wiped his hands on his coat. He was calm, collected, and just as silent as the darkness around him. The crime was perfect. No one would ever know. Not yet. He turned and walked towards the back door. His footsteps echoed in the empty house. Every sound amplified in the eerie quiet. He didn't look back. He knew the darkness would cover everything. He knew he was safe. But the unease, that unsettling feeling, lingered. He was good at this. Very good. He had done it before. And yet something felt different this time. As he stepped into the cold night air, the wind bit at his skin. He paused. His eyes scanned the empty street. Everything was still, too still. A low hum filled his ears. It was almost as if the world had gone silent, waiting for something. He quickened his pace, heading down the street. But his mind was restless. What if someone had heard? What if she had left something behind, something they could trace? The thoughts gnawed at him, but the thrill of getting away with it pushed them aside. He reached his car, parked in the shadows. His hand trembled as he unlocked the door. He slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. The hum in his ears grew louder. It was almost a voice now. A whisper. He shook his head. It was nothing. Just his imagination. He started the car, the engine rumbling to life. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the road ahead. But as he drove, the feeling didn't fade. It stayed with him, growing stronger. Like something was following. Watching. He glanced into the rearview mirror. There was nothing there. But he couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling that his past was catching up with him. The road stretched out before him, empty and desolate. But that unease, that prickling sensation, refused to let go. His hands gripped the wheel tighter. The hum in his ears grew louder, now almost deafening. He glanced in the rear-view mirror again. This time, something was there. A shadow. It flickered, then disappeared. He blinked. Was it just his mind playing tricks? He pressed harder on the accelerator. The headlights cut through the darkness like a blade, but the shadows seemed to grow closer with each passing mile. His breath quickened. His pulse raced. He looked again. Nothing. But the feeling was still there. He could feel eyes on him. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, suffocating him. The hum in his ears, the whisper, grew louder. And then, for the first time, he realized it wasn't in his head. It wasn't just his imagination. It was real. Something was following him. He could almost hear its footsteps behind him, keeping pace with his car. A sudden flash of lights in his mirror. A car. No, it couldn't be. He swerved, his heart leaping into his throat. But there was no car behind him. Only the blackness of the night. His grip on the wheel was slick with sweat now. His breath shallow. He knew he couldn't escape it. No matter how fast he drove, the past was right there, chasing him. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The engine roared, the car speeding faster into the abyss. But in the reflection of the mirror, a face appeared. A pale, hollow face. It wasn't hers, but it was just as haunting. A face from his past, someone he thought he had left behind. The face smiled. The eyes glinted with cold satisfaction. He screamed, slamming the brakes. But it was too late. The road in front of him shattered into pieces. And in that moment, he knew there was no escape. The car lurched, its tires screeching against the gravel. He fought the wheel, but it was useless. Everything spun out of control. The world tilted. He felt weightless, detached from reality. The crash was inevitable. And then it came violent, jarring. Glass shattered, metal twisted. For a brief, breathless moment, time stopped. Then everything exploded into pain. He gasped, struggling to breathe, his vision blurred. Blood trickled down his forehead. His body felt heavy, broken. But even in the chaos, the feeling didn't fade. That presence, that suffocating weight, pressed in from every side. He wasn't alone. He tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. The hum in his ears had become deafening, like a relentless chant. "Run," the voice whispered. It was cold, sharp, a command. He could feel it, the thing that had been haunting him, now drawing closer. His eyes darted around the wrecked interior of the car. The headlights flickered, casting long shadows over the cracked windshield. And then, from the dark, something shifted. A figure stepped into the beam of light. His breath hitched. It was her. Her face was pale, lifeless, eyes wide with terror. The same eyes that had haunted him for so long. The same woman whose life he had stolen. She was here. She was real. His heart hammered against his ribs. He couldn't look away. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hand reached toward him. Her fingers curled, beckoning him forward. But the fear that gripped him now wasn't just from her presence. It was the realization. He hadn't escaped. The darkness he thought he left behind had followed him here. Her figure stepped closer, moving in jerky motions, like a puppet on strings. The world around him seemed to collapse inward. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, as if something unseen was crushing him. He wanted to scream, but his voice failed him. And then, in the stillness, a sound, quiet, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone was walking toward him from behind. Someone he knew. The footsteps grew louder, each step deliberate and heavy. A familiar sound that sent chills down his spine. He didn't dare look behind him, but he could feel it, the presence growing closer. He could smell it now, that same sickly sweet cologne from before. His heart thudded in his chest, an uncontrollable, frantic beat. His breath came in short gasps. The figure in front of him, her, stayed motionless, watching him. Her eyes locked with his, empty and cold, as if she was waiting for something. A whisper of air brushed his neck, and he froze. The footsteps had stopped. There was a heavy silence. Then, a low voice cut through the stillness. "You thought you could outrun it." The voice was haunting, unmistakable. It was him, the man, the one who had haunted her, and now haunted him. The realization hit like a physical blow. The past, the terror, the crimes, they were all connected. Everything had led to this moment. He slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting the shadow behind him. There he stood, tall and menacing. His face was partially obscured in the darkness, but the gleam in his eyes was unmistakable. "You can't escape, you know." The man's voice was a cold whisper. He stepped forward, his footfalls echoing in the wreckage of the car. It was too late. There was no running anymore. The man crouched down, his face inching closer. And then he smiled. A wicked, knowing smile. The world around them seemed to disappear, replaced by a suffocating darkness. The air was thick with the scent of decay. The hum in his ears grew louder again, almost drowning out his thoughts. He could feel the weight of everything crashing in on him. His past, his crimes, they had all come full circle. The woman, the shadow, the man, he was caught in a web of his own making. And now, there was no escape. Not anymore. The man's grin widened, his teeth glinting in the dim light. His eyes never left the protagonist's, cold and unforgiving. "Do you finally understand?" The man's voice was slow, deliberate. He leaned closer, his breath rancid, mingling with the scent of blood and broken glass. The protagonist's chest tightened with terror, each breath harder than the last. Every nerve in his body screamed for release, for escape. But the weight of his guilt, his fear, kept him pinned. The shadows of the car seemed to press in, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, but his throat was raw, unresponsive. His limbs were heavy, almost paralyzed. The woman's figure still stood, her eyes never leaving his face. Her presence now wasn't just haunting, it was suffocating. A voice echoed in his mind, a memory long buried. Once you do it, you can't undo it. He had thought he could outrun it. He had believed he could bury it all, leave it in the past. But the past had found him, clawing its way into his every thought, his every move. "I never wanted this," he whispered, his voice cracked, barely audible. But the man only laughed. A hollow, mocking sound that filled the wreckage of the car. "Wanted it? It's never about what you want. It's about what you deserve." The man reached down, his hand gripping the protagonist's chin with a force that made him wince. "Do you feel it now?" The man's voice was like ice, each word cutting deeper. "I've been watching you, waiting for this moment." The protagonist's heart hammered in his chest, every second pulling him deeper into the suffocating nightmare. His mind raced, trying to piece together how he could survive, how he could escape this. But there was no way out. Not anymore. The woman's figure stepped forward, her cold eyes still fixed on him. And then, in a swift motion, she reached down, her hand curling around his throat. It was as if time stopped. Her grip tightened, slow and deliberate, cutting off his breath. The darkness around him deepened, and all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, growing fainter, weaker. The man stood back, watching with satisfaction as the life drained from his victim. The air grew colder, sharper. The last breath he took was jagged, desperate. And then nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. The shadows seemed to swallow everything. All that remained was the wreckage, both of the car and of the man's past. The final, irreversible consequence of his own actions. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. The wreckage of the car seemed to be the only thing still alive, its twisted metal groaning under the weight of the moment. But the man, he was gone. His body lay lifeless, his face twisted in an expression of final terror. The woman stood over him, her cold eyes fixed on his lifeless form. For a long moment she did nothing. She simply watched. Then, a faint whisper broke the stillness. Finally, the voice was soft, but it carried a weight of finality. And as it echoed through the wreckage, a shadow seemed to retreat into the darkness. The woman took one last look at the broken body before turning and disappearing into the night. Her steps were silent, but her presence lingered like an imprint on the very air. As she vanished into the shadows, the wreckage of the car was left to tell the story. The darkness swallowed everything. All that remained was the cold, the silence, and the suffocating weight of the past. The past that could never be outrun. The night swallowed the wreckage whole, its blackness consuming everything in sight. The air, once still, seemed to stir, the faintest breath of wind curling through the remains of a car. But the presence was gone. The shadows no longer moved. It was as if the earth itself had exhaled. Yet, there was an unsettling stillness, an emptiness that couldn't be explained. A place where time seemed to stop, holding its breath, waiting. In the distance, the faint hum of city lights flickered like fading stars. But none of it reached the place where the wreckage lay. None of it reached the man, whose body was now lifeless, his twisted form forever entwined with the consequences of his own actions. A cold, ghostly presence seemed to hang in the air, unseen but ever present. And somewhere, far off, the sound of footsteps echoed once more. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder. Someone was coming, but it wasn't the same person. No, this was something different. Something worse. With every step, the feeling of dread grew, clawing its way into the very core of the earth. The footsteps stopped just outside the wreckage. And then a voice. Not human, not fully alive, just a whisper, chilling and distant. I told you there was no escaping. The voice echoed in the darkness, vibrating through the wreckage, shaking the very foundation of what was real. And then everything went still. The wind died. The world held its breath once more. And in the empty space, a shadow moved. It didn't belong to the living. It didn't belong to the dead. It was something in between. Something that waited. Something that would never leave. Not until it had taken everything. Not until it had claimed every last trace of what was once human. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, it smiled. The smile was cold, like the last breath of a winter storm. It stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it seemed to consume the darkness itself. The shadow moved closer, its presence making the air thick and oppressive. Every corner of the wreckage felt alive, vibrating with a strange, otherworldly energy. The man's body remained where it had fallen, twisted and broken. Yet there was no peace in death. No finality. A whisper of movement brushed against the wreckage, like a sigh, long and slow. The figure was closer now. Its form was formless, indistinct, but its power was undeniable. The space around it seemed to bend and warp, as though reality itself was yielding to its will. There was no escape from it. No turning away. The shadow paused over the man's body. It reached out, its hand long and thin, ending in claws that scraped against the cold metal of the wreckage. For a moment, it lingered, almost as if savoring the moment. Then, with an inhuman speed, the claws pierced the body, sinking deep into the lifeless form. The earth trembled. The man's body jerked, as if pulled from the inside. But it wasn't a resurrection. No, this was something far worse. It was as if the very soul was being dragged from the body, leaving nothing behind but emptiness. The man's face contorted, eyes wide open in eternal terror. But there was no sound, no scream, only the whisper of the shadow, slowly draining everything it touched. The silence returned, but it was different now. The air was heavy, thick with the remnants of something that shouldn't exist. The figure stood, still and silent, as it held the man's soul in its grasp. It had taken everything, his life, his essence. And with that, it turned, its shape flickering like a dying flame. As it moved away, the ground seemed to sink beneath it, leaving only the void in its wake. The wreckage of the car lay in ruins, its twisted metal glowing faintly under the pale light of the moon. The only sound left was the faint hum of the wind, but even that felt distant. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the darkness, the figure waited, silent, patient, for its next victim. The wind picked up again, howling through the wreckage. It carried with it a whisper, a soft, breathless murmur that seemed to echo through the very fabric of the night. There was no moon, no stars in the sky. Only the blackness, thick and suffocating, pressing down from all sides. The wreckage of the car sat alone, abandoned, but it felt like something had been left behind. Not just a body, not just a soul, but a presence, something that lingered, an unnatural weight that settled over everything. The shadow, the figure, had taken what it needed. But it wasn't done. It never was. Somewhere in the distance, a faint scream pierced the silence, but it was cut off as quickly as it had started. A lone figure wandered through the night, unaware of the fate that had just befallen the man in the wreckage. Her footsteps were soft, tentative, each step echoing in the stillness of the world around her. Her eyes darted nervously, as if she could feel the weight of something unseen watching her. But she kept moving forward, driven by something she couldn't understand. Her breath came in short, quick bursts, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. She wasn't alone. The presence, no, the shadow was near. It had followed her here. It had always been waiting. Her heart began to race. She could feel the ground beneath her feet shift, as if the earth itself was trying to reject her. But she kept walking, faster now, as though her instincts told her she had to escape. The wind howled louder, a roar now, almost deafening. Her pulse quickened. The silence before had been oppressive, but now it was unbearable. She turned around. Nothing. No one. But the feeling, it was there. A cold chill crept up her spine, the hairs on her neck standing on end. She could hear it now. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, following her every move. And then, a voice, a whisper in the dark. "You're next." Her breath caught in her throat. The world spun and she turned to run. But she was too late. The darkness consumed her. Her footsteps faltered, the ground beneath her feet crumbling as if the earth itself was swallowing her whole. The voice echoed again, closer now, a low rasp that sent chills crawling up her spine. "You're next." She turned, heart pounding, eyes wide with terror. The shadow was there. Not a man, not a woman, but something far darker, its form shifting, melting into the night like liquid. The air around her seemed to warp, bending unnaturally, pulling her toward the void. She stumbled back, her breath shallow, her mind racing. But it was useless. The figure was moving toward her, its presence filling the space with an unbearable pressure. Her vision blurred as she felt the weight of its gaze upon her. It didn't speak, didn't need to. Its cold, empty eyes told her everything she needed to know. It was waiting for her. Her heart thundered in her chest, and the world around her seemed to dissolve into the shadows. The wind screamed as if it was alive, the force of it pushing her back with each step. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt tight, like invisible hands were choking her. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her backward, away from the thing that was so much more than just a shadow. But with every step she took, it came closer. Its shape twisted, like smoke rising from a dying fire. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the night. No voice, no words, just a sound that made her skin crawl. Then, it reached out, its hand nothing but a mass of dark energy, long fingers stretching toward her. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She could feel the cold of its touch even though it hadn't yet made contact. Her eyes squeezed shut, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. Her mind raced, her heartbeat pounding in her ears, but the world around her was silent, still, as if frozen in time. And then she felt it. The hand was there, cold, sharp, and all-consuming. Her body tensed, but she couldn't escape. She couldn't move. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was the figure's eyes, empty, black, endless. And then there was nothing, just the void. The figure, now fully formless, drifted away, leaving the empty space behind. The world, once again, fell into a suffocating silence. The wind died. The air grew still. And in the blackness, the figure waited for the next one. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick. Time itself seemed to stand still, as if caught in the web of darkness spun by the figure. The absence of sound, the emptiness of the world around, was suffocating. And then, something stirred in the distance, a faint sound. A rustle, a whisper, like the shifting of leaves in a windless night. But there was no wind, only the echo of footsteps. A figure appeared on the horizon, slowly approaching the wreckage. Another one, unaware of the horror that had unfolded. Her footsteps were hesitant at first, the caution of someone who could feel the weight of something wrong in the air. Her head turned from side to side, scanning the dark, seeking the source of the unease creeping up her spine. She had no idea what lay ahead. The shadows seemed to stir as she drew closer, as though recognizing her, waiting for her. She couldn't see it yet, but she could feel it, the pressure of unseen eyes watching her every move. The temperature dropped, and a chill gripped her bones. She pulled her coat tighter around her, her breath escaping in visible puffs. The wreckage loomed ahead of her, twisted metal and shattered glass gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She stopped in her tracks. Her eyes narrowed as she saw the remnants of the previous chaos, the broken body, the bloodstains, the eerie stillness of the place. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. A low growl reverberated through the air, distant at first, but growing louder, closer. Her heart skipped a beat. Her feet froze, unwilling to move forward or retreat. The air turned dense, thick with something foul. The wind began to howl again, but this time, it wasn't a breeze. It was the very breath of something ancient and cruel. And in that moment she knew. Something was waiting. It was already here. The footsteps that had been following her now grew louder, almost deafening. And then, as if in a blur of motion, the shadows shifted. A figure, tall and indistinct, materialized from the darkness. The same dark, twisting form that had haunted the others. The same emptiness in its eyes. It was no longer a shadow. It was solid, real, and closer than she could ever imagine. Before she could move, the air around her thickened, suffocating her, locking her in place. The figure was standing right before her now, its eyes dark pools of nothingness. And in that cold, final moment, it whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "You're next." The world stood still for a long, breathless moment. The figure's presence towered over her, its eyes dark, endless, like two voids pulling everything toward them. She couldn't breathe. Her body felt frozen, trapped in the web of its gaze. The wind, which had once howled like a storm, now stood silent, as though even nature feared to make a sound. The darkness around them seemed to grow thicker, swallowing everything around her. The wreckage of the car, the twisted metal, the shattered glass, all of it faded into the blackness, leaving only the two of them in the emptiness. Her heart raced, hammering against her chest like a trapped animal. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear, rooted to the spot. The figure leaned closer, its cold breath sending a shiver down her spine. "You can't outrun it." Its voice was low, like the sound of wind passing through dry leaves, almost distant but strangely sharp. She tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but her mouth was dry, her throat closing in on itself. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they wouldn't fall. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, alive, feeding on her fear. The figure's shadow stretched long, too long, as though it was swallowing the world whole. "You belong to it now," it whispered. In that moment she knew there was no escape. Her body finally obeyed her mind, and she stumbled backward, her feet skidding on the cold ground. But the figure moved faster. It reached out, its hand coming down upon her like the crushing weight of a falling star. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt its grip tighten, icy and unyielding. A scream tried to tear its way out of her, but it was swallowed whole by the shadow. The darkness closed in around her, pulling her into it, into the abyss where nothing could escape. And then there was nothing. No sound, no light, just the void. The last whisper lingered in the air. Next, the stillness that followed was profound. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no faint hum of life. Just a crushing, suffocating silence. The darkness seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a living thing, its weight pressing against everything. The world had become a place where even the shadows dared not move. No one else would come. No one else would hear the whispers that had haunted those who were taken. For the figure, there was no end. It existed, waiting, patiently, drawing in the lost, the desperate, and the terrified. And as the final victim disappeared into the blackness, the wreckage of the car remained, its twisted form the only sign of what had happened. But even the car was slowly fading, its outline blurring into the night, as if it were never really there at all. In the emptiness, the whispers continued, just beyond hearing, as if the very air was thick with the voices of the lost. Somewhere, deep in the heart of the darkness, the figure stood, waiting for the next one to cross its path. Time had no meaning here. The cycle would continue, over and over, a pattern that could never be broken. The figure, its shadow growing longer with each passing moment, remained vigilant, its cold, empty eyes scanning the world for its next victim. It was always watching, always waiting, and the void, the darkness that it had claimed, would never let go. As the final breaths of the last soul taken faded into the night, only one thing remained certain: the story never ends. It simply waits for the next chapter.